This will be a 180 literary 7 minutes. Ready? Begin. The opportunities for individuals to have their internal equilibrium upset are far greater today than they were a generation ago. It's important not to romanticize the past, however. While I grew up in a society which was much more stable and where I didn't have anything like the kind of forces bearing down on me that teenagers do today, I also lived in a segregated society in which a huge number of people my age were never going to be given any opportunities that I took for granted. So it is important for us to overly romanticize the past, but also to recognize that the present is changing so fast and people are exposed to so many different things that it is very, very difficult to build the kind of coherent, character-based society that builds both individual and social responsibility and gives people the necessary balance between stability and change that allows you to live the fullest possible, most rewarding life, and to have a society that is both growing and vibrant and stable. I think we all recognize that as a sort of central challenge of the time. And I think what happens when a big disaster occurs, everybody throws off all the things that are bothering them and gets back to basics. People stop looking at each other as a people of different races or religions or philosophical positions or political parties and realize that there is a common humanity there after all. The trick will be to manage our differences on a daily basis in a way that recognizes our common humanity and to find organized ways to stamp out the social evils that are consuming us without doing away with our personal freedoms. And I believe that we can do these things. I believe that sometimes we throw up our hands too much in the face of all the difficulties that we have. But we have to identify what the problems are and move on them. Everyone has a role to play, and we can solve this in a free and open society, not by any governmental policy, but by government, like every other part of society, playing its own role. If we could start with some of the problems that are disintegrating forces in our society, I would like to focus on some that we don't often focus on, and those are the economic ones. We all know we have too much crime and violence and drugs and family breakdown. And I don't mean to minimize those things. They are profoundly important, but we are aware and sensitive to those things. I want you also to think about things that may be more pedestrian, but also are reinforcing the problem that we come here to talk about. The average American today is working a longer work week and spending fewer hours with his or her children than they were 25 years ago. They are working for the same or lower wages than they were making 15 years ago. Literally 60% of the American workforce is making the same or less when you adjust for inflation than they were making 15 years ago, and working harder and spending less time with their children than they were 25 years ago. Family income has gone up in so many places only because there are now two workers in the family. There is also in our country a feeling that there is much less security because more and more people are changing their jobs. The census tells us that there's been about a 14% decline in earnings for men between the ages of 45 and 55. It could have something to do with the so-called angry white male phenomenon. And now we're having to feel anxieties about things that we thought would be behind us as a people into our 40s and 50s. This is a profound thing. No one has really studied the implications this has for citizenship and why more and more people may be vulnerable to siren songs of resentment that divided us instead of unite us. I'm telling you, there are millions of people that go home every night and sit down at the dinner table and look across the table at their families and wonder whether they have failed them. This is a significant thing. And there is the fact that there is so much mobility in this society, much more than ever before. It is more difficult for many of these people to get the kind of support networks they need in their communities, because a lot of folks live in communities where neighbors don't know their neighbors anymore. And if there's a high crime rate in the community, they don't have any way to get to know them. So that all these things need to be seen in that context. There is a great deal of uncertainty out there, which makes people yearn for certainty, but also makes them vulnerable to the wrong kind of certainty, certainty that pits people against one another instead of giving them a way to say, here are my problems. What are your problems? Let's get together and figure out how to solve them. So I think that the sense of physical instability so many adults feel makes it more difficult to hold our society together, and makes it more difficult to impart the fundamental character strengths and traits and the accompanying security of knowing that you're in the right place in your life. Now, one of the things that we have thought about in our administration is that in this environment, when so many of our children are in families that are not traditional families, when their parents are working harder and maybe spending less time with them, and when their neighborhoods may be less settled and in many cases less safe, it is more important than it has been, perhaps in immediately previous years, to reemphasize the role of character education in our schools, something which once was taken for granted as a part of education, sort of faded away, and we believe it should be brought back. We know it has to be a supplement for the work that families and communities do, not a replacement. We know there's no substitute for the character lessons that are imparted to people by their parents and grandparents, or for the guidance that a father or mother can bring, or maybe even more importantly, for the sense of security and rootedness that the right kind of relationships within families give us all. But still, I think it's important to recognize that all of our children show up for school sooner or later, and character education can be a vital part of building the kind of society that recognizes responsibilities and has a sense of community. This is an issue I've been involved with for years. Several years ago, in the mid-'80s, I served on the Carnegie Commission for Middle School Education. There were two governors on that commission. I had the privilege of being one. The other was the distinguished Republican governor of New Jersey, Tom Kean. And one of the recommendations we made was that we should teach our children in middle school with specific objectives to behave ethically and assume the responsibilities of citizenship in a pluralistic society, and that we had to connect our schools to our communities, which together share responsibility for each student's success. When I became president, we started to work on this through the Department of Education. Secretary Riley has helped us to do a good ways toward the right kind of introduction of values into our schools.